and I wanted to officially start our webinar today with a land acknowledgement. I'm recording and hosting this webinar from the original territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which means people of the Longhouse. The Haudenosaunee settled and thrived in this area long before Europeans arrived and still reside in Western New York and the Western New York area. Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper acknowledges them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. A Haudenosaunee principle is to live in harmony with the surrounding environment. They believe all life should be respected and cared for because we are all connected, and what happens to one living thing affects all living things. Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper has seen firsthand how pollution and toxic waste impact living things, specifically in and along the Buffalo River. As the coordinator for the decades-long cleanup of this federally designated area of concern, Waterkeeper and those who know the Buffalo River well have seen that cleaning up this waterway has had a huge impact on our local economy and communities. I'm now going to introduce Sarah Koslow, Ecological Programs Manager from Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper. Sarah has a master's degree in cultural communication and another in environmental law and policy. Her work has focused on environmental justice through environmental communication and policy, and she's been working with our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force on our JEDI-oriented efforts. Sarah will be helping us to better understand environmental justice and where that term comes from. Our hope is that this will provide a strong foundation for you all as we continue to learn and unlearn and work for positive change in our communities. So take it away, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. We have a really great turnout today, so thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here. I'm going to go through the agenda quickly. Oh, there we go. So today we're going to be looking at what is environmental justice and what is environmental racism, and give a couple of examples of both of those. And then we're going to turn things over to our awesome panelists to tell you a little bit more about environmental justice in the Buffalo area in Western New York. So starting with environmental justice, what is environmental justice? If we break down the two components, there's environment, and the environment is often thought of as natural resources. So water, air, our forests, our farmland, but often what we don't think of when we're thinking of environment and environmental justice is that environment is actually the place that we live. So it's our home, it's the schools that we spend our days in, it's our neighborhoods and our communities, it's indoors, it's outdoors. And then when we think of justice, justice is generally fairness or fair treatment. Lawfulness is another word. So basically, this is an introduction to environmental justice, and we want to learn a little bit more about everyone that's in the audience. So Liz, do you want to put up the first poll question? Great. Awesome. Happy to see that there are a lot of students out there. So moving on to what is environmental justice? There are two definitions that I'm going to give, but they're both complementary. So this first one is more of a grassroots take on environmental justice, and it's a social movement seeking fairness in the distribution of environmental impacts. Environmental impacts are the things that are negatively affecting our communities. So these can be impacts from industry, or from decisions that society makes. And these are the impacts that affect our home, our neighborhoods, our schools, the air we breathe, the water we drink. So environmental justice is essentially making sure that our environment is safe from these impacts. The second definition is more of the legal official definition of environmental justice. And this one is given from the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA as some people know it. And the EPA is an agency, a federal agency of the United States. So actually, a fun fact, the EPA was created 50 years ago yesterday, so it's officially 50 years old. So the EPA's definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So again, this is more of the legal definition, but it's a term and expectation that exists under our federal government. This isn't just a made-up thing. So historically, it's been pretty difficult to prove cases of environmental justice, and it hasn't been regularly enforced. But there's a lot of hope that under this next administration, environmental justice will be a priority and find its place in the climate change agenda. Also, we'll go a little bit more into the different laws that comprise environmental justice in our third webinar. So because of environmental injustice, there's a term that's environmental racism. Unfortunately, most instances of environmental justice are examples of environmental racism. Environmental racism was created by racist laws, regulations, and government practices. So definition being actions and decisions that result in the disproportionate exposure of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to environmental hazards. Race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil. And over 50% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color. About 40% are exposed to higher levels of nitrogen dioxide, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color are 2 times more likely to live without potable water. Kind of tying back to the previous slide about the EPA, 95% of people that have filed claims against polluters had their claim denied by the EPA, 95%. So now we're going to look at a quick video that's going to further explain environmental racism.
In America, air and water are separate but unequal. Environmental racism is the new Jim Crow. Yeah, I get it. The environment isn't a person. How can it be racist? But the most basic pieces of the environment, the air we breathe and the water we drink, are controlled and designed by people. And people can be racist. More than half of all people who live close to hazardous waste are people of color. Floodplains nationwide have high populations of Blacks and Hispanics. Black children are twice as likely to suffer from lead poisoning as white children. This inequality is no accident. Pollution and the risk of disaster are assigned to Black and brown communities through generations of discrimination and political neglect. Enslaved Africans were commodities partly because their work carried environmental risks that were unacceptable to whites, like exposure to heat, malaria, and mosquitoes. As Jim Crow laws created racial segregation, they also reinforced an environmental system that still disadvantages minorities. It's no wonder that Black and Hispanic children have the highest rates of asthma. Hurricanes like Katrina, Sandy, and Matthew did their worst damage in communities of color. Rich white neighborhoods can update their water pipes, but not places like Flint. The Jim Crow laws are dead and gone, but the fact that people of color are still more likely to die from environmental causes is no accident.
So I pulled a quote from the video below. Pollution and the risk of disaster are assigned to Black and brown communities through generations of discrimination and political neglect. It's not by accident, and it wasn't a recent thing. So this graphic shows that Latinx and Black communities are disproportionately exposed to pollution, and they're exposed to over twice as much pollution than they produce, where white communities are exposed to about 20% less than they actually produce. These were a couple of Instagram posts that I pulled. The two on the left are from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Dirty polluters be like, I know a spot, and then just move to environmental justice communities. And what I like about the quote in the top left is, it says, if we really truly want to build peace and prosperity for people on the planet, we have to look at the issue of climate change with the understanding of the legacy and impacts of environmental racism and classism. The graphic on the right just kind of breaks down the different components of environmental racism. Race is the #1 indicator for the placement of toxic facilities in the United States. It creates health risks, asthma, cancer, reproductive harm, etc. Industrial polluters, those are the different types of pollution that often occur. Disproportionately impacts people of color and low-income communities, particularly in Black neighborhoods. Some of the toxics that are emitted in the air and water. And one thing that I think people often forget related to environmental justice is food deserts. There are communities that don't have access to fresh food or grocery stores as a result of years of these policies being in place. So coming back to environmental justice, as we saw in some of the previous slides, race is the #1 predictor of whether or not you live near clean air, water, and soil. So Liz, do you want to pop up the next poll question? Okay, so how would you describe the racial makeup of your neighborhood? So in Buffalo, racial policy, well, everywhere, but racial policies in the early 20th century excluded Black residents from certain neighborhoods. And later in the 1950s, the white families that lived in Buffalo moved to some of the outlying Erie County suburbs, which created further divisions. So today, 35% of Black residents in Buffalo metro area live in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And that's more than twice the natural average. So Buffalo was one of those cities that was hit particularly hard by policies like redlining. So Liz, do you want to put up the next question? So go ahead and answer what sort of area you're attending from. So it looks like about half of you are suburban. Nice, about 40% are urban. 5% rural, okay. So this is tied to racist policies that prevented Black, Indigenous, and people of color from living in certain areas, which also prevented them from accumulating wealth. Also, by not involving Black, Latinx, Native American, low-income communities in environmental decision-making regarding their own environment. Okay, so Liz, do you want to launch the next question? Okay, so how would you describe your neighborhood? There you go. Got the wealthy, low income, and somewhere in between breakdown. So all of these different factors affect where people live, whether they have access to clean air and water, natural space, whether there's a grocery store, whether you've had opportunities to accumulate wealth. So if you think of it this way, if you're white, if you're middle to upper middle class, and something goes wrong, you can pick up and move away to a different neighborhood, or you can talk to the people that are making decisions, or you can use your wealth or your connections to stop a polluter from putting a landfill in your backyard, for example. But if you're Black, the cards have pretty much been stacked against you for the past 100 years. And this disparity is environmental injustice. So this is the last slide we'll go through, and then we'll get to hear the good part from all of the panelists. So this slide gives a couple of examples of environmental injustice. Some of the more commonly thought of kinds are like air or water pollution. So for example, if you live in an apartment building that's near a highway intersection, maybe where cars are idling, it might be more affordable because of the noise and the pollution. Maybe there's a lack of green space. So if you are part of a low income area, a lot of the time you just can't afford to live somewhere else and you're exposed to negative impacts. Often too, low income communities are built in areas where flooding occurs if you live near water. So that can create property damage that it's difficult to recover from. Sometimes there's sewage in the streets from old sewer systems. And then also, as in Flint, a lot of the time in older neighborhoods, there can be lead in pipes. And if it's a low income area, resources might not be allocated to replace those pipes. Another example would be having a landfill placed near your property. So a landfill obviously smells and gives off various gases, but you also have the traffic of the trucks coming and going, maybe speeding down neighborhood streets. You have the liquids that gather at the bottom of the landfill or seep out that can get into groundwater or waterways. And then there's the example of having someone take your land or water. And this is something that Native American tribes have been experiencing basically since white settlers came to the United States. And they have a long history of having their land taken from them. And today they have a sovereign right to a lot of their tribal land, but still they're battling oil pipelines that are being put through without their approval, or having traditional lands reduced in size. There's the example of low income and Black neighborhoods that have had highways put right through the middle of neighborhoods. And finally, there's the example of toxic chemicals being in close proximity. And one example here in Buffalo is Love Canal. Or throughout the rest of New York State, there have been a couple of facilities that have closed that have been leaking PFAS into the local waterways or wells. On the right, there's a little graphic that has some of the most infamous examples of environmental racism around the country. No surprise that it's Detroit, Los Angeles, and then the last one is in Louisiana, which has compounded environmental injustice issues. So now that we've provided a few general examples, we're going to turn to our panelists, and we can learn a little bit from them about local examples of environmental injustice and the work that they're doing for environmental justice.
So our first panelist is Emily from the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York. A member of Clean Air since 2015, Emily has been involved in leadership roles throughout the organization, including being a member of the Tonawanda Coke campaign team. She joined the staff in 2020, bringing with her over 10 years of organizing and training experience on local, state, and federal campaigns. She believes deeply in a rigorous, disciplined, and care-centered organizing practice that builds our community's power to live in a just, dignified, and joyful world we all deserve. Emily grew up in Buffalo's Riverside neighborhood, is a proud mama of 3 and lover of grease, cut pepperoni, and Paul's Donuts. All right, so take it away, Emily.
Great, thank you so much. So hello, everyone. It's really lovely to be with all of you this evening. Again, my name is Emily Tirana, and I'm with the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York. I serve as our Leadership Development Director and the Environmental Justice Organizer for our environmental justice campaigns that we're going to spend some time talking about. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Clean Air. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Clean Air is an environmental justice and just transition organization here in Western New York. Our work is in primarily in Erie County, in the city of Buffalo, the Tonawondas, Grand Island, and Kenmore. And we're going to see a map in a few minutes of exactly where our campaign issues are. But overall, our mission is to build power by developing grassroots leaders who organize their own communities to run and win environmental justice and public health campaigns in Western New York. So what I think, one of the things that I really love about Clean Air and why I joined the staff here is that this is about public health and the environment. So the impacts and the legacy of polluters, pollution, hazardous waste, as well as unfair and unequal racist and sexist workplace policies as we build the new world, that we want to make sure that we are remediating all of that as we go into the world that we're building. And we do this work really grounded in our values. And so if we could go to the next slide. We have values of leadership development, which really show up in that all of our campaigns are run by people who are living in environmental justice areas or working in workplaces where there is also environmental injustice and environmental racism. And so we invest deeply in training and opportunities for people to take action and to speak for themselves. Environmental justice, democratic decision-making, honoring resident knowledge, race and class equity and inclusion. This is an incredibly important and central value of our organization, especially because our organization started by organizing folks in the Tonawondas, which is a primarily white working and middle class neighborhood. So we need to be very clear about our interest in ending white supremacy and class inequality as we are doing environmental justice work. And then finally, appreciation, recognition, and celebration. This work is hard. If anybody has ever done environmental justice or any kind of social justice organizing knows that this is grueling work. And if we don't take time to bring joy into our work and to celebrate what we've accomplished, we're not going to get anything done. So we can go to the next slide. So again, our members identify and tackle the problems in their own neighborhoods and organize for solutions that meet their needs for current and future generations. Next slide. This is just a map of where we organize. So I'm going to put some things in the chat. I think when I'm not presenting, this map is in our new membership handbook if you want to learn more about our organization, and I hope that you do. Okay, we can go next. So again, our work is bucketed. I like to think in buckets. It's how my brain works, in environmental justice, just transition, and grassroots fundraising. So in our work around environmental justice, we're thinking about Tonawanda Coke and American Axle, which I'm gonna talk about a lot more in a moment, and then just transition. And I think Franchelle is also going to talk a lot about what just transition means and how it is showing up here in Western New York. But for us, when we think about just transition, it's how do we move from an extractive economy, an economy that is centered on racism, classism, and extraction and pollution of the earth and our resources, to build an economy that's centered in care, healing, regeneration that is equitable and fair and safe for all of us. And so in this work, we work on the Huntley, the former energy coal plant in Tonawanda. In Seneca Babcock, folks are reimagining a former concrete crushing facility that was unpermitted and disgusting into a carbon sink land trust, which is super dope. And then the Tesla Gigafactory 2, which is supposed to be a beacon of light and love and all these green things, and that has received $959 million of taxpayer subsidies, and is actually an incredibly racist and sexist workplace. And so we're organizing current and former workers there. And then we do a good number of grassroots fundraising things so that our members are determining the trajectory of our work. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about American Axle and Tonawanda Coke. So if we could go to the next slide. So Tonawanda Coke, if folks aren't familiar, is a now closed coking facility that is in Tonawanda, New York. So if you are familiar with the area, it's not far away from the Grand Island Bridge. It's you can see it off of the 190. If you're coming across back into the mainland from Grand Island, you can see those smokestacks. They're very ubiquitous. Coking was a process that is necessary in the production of steel, and so and it was a really, really active, it was built in the early 1900s and was owned by a company before Tonawanda Coke, which was called Allied Chemical, which is now known as Honeywell International. So I could spend an entire half an hour or more talking about the history of the campaign, but what you need to know for this presentation is that in 2009, after years of organizing by residents, the federal government, as well as some other folks, went in and raided the plant. And in 2013, Tonawanda Coke was brought to federal court and found guilty of violating 14 different federal laws under the Clean Air Act and the Resource Recovery. I wrote this down, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act around hazardous waste. And their environmental manager was sentenced to 1 year in prison and fined $20,000 for his activities in this plant. Tonawanda Coke was criminally mismanaged for years, for decades. There were a number of spills and other ways that the company operated that were in complete violation of the law and caused a tremendous amount of health effects in the surrounding community, including in the neighborhood that I grew up in, Riverside, inside of Buffalo. So after the federal lawsuit, there was Tonawanda Coke had to pay millions of dollars in fines, had to fund a public health study, and they had to make a number of improvements to their building. After that, there was a 92% reduction in benzene, which is a hazardous chemical that takes lots of different forms, but in the form of air pollution, has been known to cause cancers such as leukemia and other things. So in 2018, the Tonawanda Coke was brought back to federal court for violating their own probation, and they ultimately filed for bankruptcy in 2018 and shut down. Since then, we've been organizing to get the site cleaned up and to make sure that as much of the site as possible can be funded by the polluter to be cleaned up, not taxpayers. So it wound up being half and half, just about, but we're moving in the right direction. And then our next piece I want to talk about is American Axle. So American Axle is on the east side of Buffalo in the Delavan and Grider neighborhood. It's a primarily Black neighborhood, whereas Tonawanda is a primarily white neighborhood, both working class neighborhoods. And American Axle was the former GM plant and produced lots of different things for cars and engines. And in 2008, it was purchased by a man named John Williams, who set about ultimately trying to redevelop and clean up the facility. In 2015, Clean Air joined a group of residents who were already organizing to get this site cleaned up. And in 2017, 5 acres of the site was put into the federal Superfund program because of the immense amount of hazardous waste that was left on site, particularly something called PCBs, which you can see in this like cavernous looking photo down there. PCBs are not water soluble and they do not break down. PCBs also, so the PCBs travel really far because nothing breaks them down, and they were found in the Skagafida Creek as well as other waterways throughout Western New York. They are known to cause cancer and autoimmune disorders like lupus, as well as intellectual and behavioral developmental challenges in folks who consume or are exposed to PCBs over time. And so what's important about both of these campaigns, they're in completely different neighborhoods. We're organizing with different people, right? But the link between them is a shared owner in John Williams. Williams also now owns Tonawanda Coke, and that this is environmental justice. This is dealing with environmental racism and environmental classism, and both of these sites need to be cleaned up to protect public health and the environment. So over the summer, we organized for community advisory groups, which would be groups of everyday folks and other stakeholders to hold the DEC, the New York State DEC, the developer, and the other responsible parties accountable to a speedy, thorough, and robust cleanup to protect public health and the environment. So the first picture that you saw when it said Spotlight on Tonawanda Coke were both of our campaign teams at the Erie County Legislature, because over the summer we had 2 unanimously passed resolutions by the Erie County Legislature in support of Clean Air's call for community advisory groups at both of these sites. And so in September of this year, we got the news that Tonawanda, the DEC was going to establish a community advisory group for Tonawanda, but they were not going to create one for American Axle. And so we could go to that next slide. And what's important to note here is that Clean Air uses a number of different tactics and strategies to reach our goals. We base build, we use narrative and media, we utilize and hold government agencies and elected officials accountable, and we also have a great deal of technical support of scientists and really smart people who are smarter than me, who know the answers and can be really, really clear about what the problems are at these different sites. And all of these strategies were used in both campaigns, and yet a group of primarily white people in Tonawanda were given an advisory group, where a group of primarily Black people in Delavan Grider around American Axle were not. And so we had a choice as an organization and as campaign teams, especially as the Tonawanda Coke team, right? We got what we wanted. The plant was shut down. We get a say in how it's cleaned up. We could just go on with our lives, but that is not what Clean Air does. That is not the values of our membership, and that is not how we're going to win. We're not going to win environmental justice for all of us if we do not center all of us and take risks and speak up, even when you may have gotten what you wanted. So if we could go to the next slide. We pulled together both of our campaign teams to write a joint letter to the Buffalo News on the impact and the clear presence of environmental racism in this decision by the DEC. And I just briefly want to read this quote from it because it's really powerful, and I can put the whole article in the chat. So as members of Clean Air's Tonawanda Coke and American Axle campaign teams, we want to make our position clear. An injustice done to one of us is an injustice done to all of us. We will not accept the state's disregard for Black health and dignity, and will not be placated by an advisory group in Tonawanda at the expense of our members in Delavan Grider. Until the DEC creates a community advisory group at American Axle, there will be no justice in either of our communities. If New York State wants to say that Black lives matter, they must stand for the health and dignity of all Black lives. Clean Air's membership in the North Towns and the city stand together with one voice in asking the DEC whose lives really matter. So pretty dope and very effective. So after this, we ruffled a lot of feathers, and we are in the process. We are about half a step to the finish line of getting American Axle their own community advisory group for cleanup, which will do wonders. Folks have been languishing and dealing with the effects of hazardous waste pollution in literally their backyards for generations. And we know that community advisory groups are the tool that we need to hold folks accountable for really robust cleanup that will sustain our families for generations to come. But that can only be done if we are clear and we center race and we center class, and that we find our solidarity through our differences. And that is my piece. And I'm going to put a bunch of things in the chat for people. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Emily. That's wonderful information. Great, so we're gonna move right along so we do our best to stay on time. If we run over a couple minutes and anyone has to leave, totally understandable. We are recording, so you will get the full recording in a few days. Our next panelist is Amy Witryol, an a resident from Niagara County. She's a retired business banking credit officer who resides in Lewiston, New York. She has spent much of the last 20 years participating in state and federal regulatory proceedings on two major environmental challenges in her community. One, preventing CWM chemical services from constructing a new national hazardous waste location and PCB disposal facility. And the other, removing federal radioactive waste temporarily stored at the Niagara Falls storage site in Lewiston since 1942. Amy has also assisted residents in Niagara Falls who opposed a rail shipment of New York City garbage to the Covanta waste incinerator. So I'm going to pass it over to Amy.
Okay, thanks, Liz. As you heard from Sarah earlier, the concept of environmental justice, which I'll refer to as EJ, is not the same as the regulation for EJ. In my Niagara County experience, even EJ regulation has not been followed by the state of New York. This is important because EPA delegates most permitting authority to the states. I'll briefly discuss just a couple of examples of New York's evasion of EJ, but the most important lesson comes from Lois Gibbs, the leader of the Love Canal movement in the 1970s, who has worked with countless communities across the nation on EJ problems since then. The lesson is, figure out who the decision maker is and focus on them like a laser. Because EPA permitting is delegated to the states, when it comes to enforcing EJ policy, the governor is where the buck stops. He is the ultimate decision maker. That doesn't mean we shouldn't learn all we can from the applicant for a permit to pollute and from the staff at agencies who brief the governor and who implement the authority to approve an application. We must be informed, but we must take any opportunity to contact the decision maker in private, in public, with speeches and signs and whatever it takes to get the message across within the law. As Lois told me 20 years ago, the applicant and the agencies can be wrong lots of the time, but if the community is wrong, the polluters have the money to flaunt any error and dismiss the public as uninformed, even though the public is usually right. And sometimes polluters will say you're wrong even when you're right. This may be because polluters will be fined if they lie to government agencies, but they do not get fined if they lie to the public. Even when a polluter submits a written EJ public outreach plan to an agency, comments made outside that plan are not reviewed by agencies. We're going to show you a slide mapping schools in Niagara Falls and air pollution sources in Niagara Falls. If we can get that slide, here we go. And they're not drawn to scale. Sorry about that, but I think if you know Niagara Falls, and you can see a little bit of Grand Island on the left, and you can see the 190 in both slides, you'll get a little bit of a perspective. Former Mayor Deister decided to allow garbage to be shipped by rail into Niagara Falls from anywhere in the U.S. for incineration at Covanta, which, as you can see, is located near the Niagara River and is also located in a state-designated EJ community. A state permit was also required for this rail access, and the New York State DEC approved an outreach plan from Covanta that called for a meeting to be held outside the EJ community for the EJ community. So, of course, no one from the EJ community attended. Covanta operates the 13th largest waste incinerator in the United States in a tiny city that is only something like the 738th largest in the United States. Does that sound a little disproportionate to you? As a second example of a disproportionate burden in Niagara County, we have the CWM chemical and PCB waste landfills in the town of Porter that operated from 1972 to 2015, and an application pending to build another. And perhaps because of that application, the public relations officer for CWM is attending this panel today. There are about 16 commercial PCB and hazardous waste landfill operations in the United States. We're going to put up a few slides showing where hazardous waste landfills are typically located. Here we have one located in the desert. And here we have one located in the desert. And then here we have one located in the desert. Now let's turn to CWM Chemical in Niagara County and see what that looks like. Oh look, the entire public school campus for kindergarten through high school for 2 towns, a village, a fish hatchery and recreational fishing area, a nearby trailer park, and 20% of the world's fresh drinking water supply, Lake Ontario, at the end of the CWM discharge pipeline, which is in the Niagara River nearby Lake Ontario. New York State says it doesn't need CWM. No business in New York says it needs CWM. CWM has been closed for 5 years, and CWM has an application that's been pending for nearly 20 years, which admits a new PCB landfill would discharge PCBs into the Niagara River. And yet the state has not yet denied CWM's application. Above and beyond EPA and state EJ policy guidelines, specific law in New York was enacted in the 1980s to prevent the siting of hazardous waste landfills in the same part of the state over and over again, but that fairness law has been ignored so far. Niagara County is the only area of the state ever to host a commercial hazardous waste landfill operation, and one which accepted waste from all of the lower 48 United States. The state of New York mapping of potential EJ communities includes the Tuscarora Reservation, which is 2 miles from CWM and which relies on that area for fishing, hunting, and harvesting medicinal plants. For CWM permitting, the DEC has recognized the Tuscarora status as an Indian nation and as a nearby population to CWM, but DEC has yet to acknowledge the Tuscarora as an EJ community in permitting decisions, even though DEC mapping designated the Tuscarora an EJ community. While New York EJ law discourages a disproportionate pollution burden on low-income and minority communities, all permitting requires agencies consider the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Among other things, this act requires agencies to determine whether an application would change existing community character. This suggests whether or not you are a poor or a Black community in Niagara Falls already surrounded by a dozen polluting smokestacks, one more smokestack will not change your community character, even if that one smokestack may potentially double your health risk. Communities must therefore emphasize EJ policy as more important. New York State mapping to identify EJ communities is based on census tracts, so rural areas where poverty is widely dispersed are almost never identified as EJ communities. In other words, while EJ is intended to prioritize the most vulnerable populations, it addresses only some of them, even if New York were to regularly follow its EJ policy. And if you are a child in a school, whether you are poor or not, if your school is near a polluter, the state may not hesitate to give you another, whether you are rural or urban, and especially in my opinion, if the polluter is a big campaign donor. You can review the history of campaign money or related charity from CWM and its parent or from Covanta and decide for yourself. The only thing that beats big money in politics is your voice and your vote. As Lois Gibbs has taught many communities over the years, focus like a laser on the decision maker and know his or her informers. then you have a fighting chance to protect your community from an unjust burden. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And our second webinar does go into some of those mapping tools that Amy referenced. So if you're not registered for that one, you can do so. All right, our next panelist is Franchelle Parker from Open Buffalo. A Western New York native, Franchelle is the founding executive director of Open Buffalo, a community collaborative whose mission is to advance racial, economic, and ecological justice for the Western New York region. Parker draws upon 2 decades of progressive advocacy, communications, community organizing, and capacity building to empower resident leaders to enact lasting changes in their communities. Parker found her start as a student organizer on the campus of Buffalo State College, fighting to repeal mandatory minimum sentencing for drug sentences. Later, she would use her degree in political science to win numerous legislative changes from the local to the national level. Whether working in the peace movement, organized labor, or political empowerment, Parker believes healthy communities and a healthy democracy are rooted in people's ability to make their own choices. All right, so I'll pass it over to Franchelle.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Franchelle Parker. I'm the executive director of Open Buffalo. Our mission is to advance racial, economic, and ecological justice for everyone all across Western New York. Our overall vision is that the people that are experiencing the systemic oppressions that all of the speakers talked about today, that they actually have the ability to have a seat at the decision-making table and the ability to solve their own issues. As most of us have already talked about today, but this nation was really founded off of stolen land, stolen people, racialized capitalism, and labor exploitation. And this is the foundation that created these systems of oppressions that we're still dealing with today. At Open Buffalo, I've been able to kind of build upon my foundation of racial, economic justice and begin to teach others how ecological wellness, sustainability is really the linchpin to equity and justice in our community. Quick story, during my time at Open Buffalo, I became a mommy, and Kennedy Ray is my whole entire world. She was just a few months old, and we were on a plane to California to learn about co-ops and second chance programs for returning citizens. During this time, it was one of the worst wildfires in California history. All the celebrities in Hollywood were losing their homes. So if it's impacting the rich, you know that regular people like us were all screwed up. So as we landed, like, I could literally see the smoke from the sky. And all I could think about was how to keep my baby safe. Certain parts of LA were starting to shut down and declaring states of emergency, but the hardworking people at Hood Boys, they stayed open. They gave us the tour and they helped us to understand how to center formerly incarcerated citizens and really figure out how to build a cooperative movement for economic justice. So this is happening in LA. Meanwhile, over in Beverly Hills and Hollywood, prisoners were being temporarily released to help fight fires for the rich. Crews of mostly Black and Latinx firefighters were risking their lives every day. However, post-release, they weren't able to actually find opportunities as firefighters because firefighters can't have felonies. And only actually this year in Cali, our formerly incarcerated granted access to apply for positions, but they still face huge discrimination in hiring, of course. I was only there for a few days, and I had the opportunity to return home, return to some form of normal. But as a community, we can't continue to run from the compounding effects of climate change, racism, and classism forever. And for me, that's what a just transition is. It's moving all 3 of these wheels at the same time. So it's here, my people. It's in our community. It's right here in our faces. Maybe it's not wildfires here in Western New York, but in New York State, we're becoming ground zero for superstorms. The climate extremes in Buffalo are now becoming a serious health hazard for low and moderate income workers and elders in our community. So someone asked me what politicized me on climate change. And, I answered, I'm like, well, I didn't have a political awakening around it. I didn't get woke about climate justice, but I did have a spiritual awakening. And I believe that our God, the creator of all, has thought about every single thing that we need in order to survive on this earth. Clean air, water, millions of fruits and vegetables, herbal medicines, land. So it's not that we live on a planet of abundance. It's our actions as humans that's tearing the planet apart. But the thing about it is that humans can actually put it all back together again. That's the beauty of the story, right? And we don't have to accept that climate change is just a part of nature. Again, we live in a planet of abundance, and we, as humans, we have to stop the system of taking and extracting and overusing and abusing. The climate crisis isn't a scientific challenge. It's a moral and spiritual dilemma. So I see my role as helping to bridge the gap. There's not a lot of people that look like me. You won't see a lot of head wraps in the traditional environmental justice movement, right? So how do I figure out how to bring my people into this conversation? So I like to bridge the gap. I'm an old school hip hop head, and I usually think in Biggie and Tupac lyrics. And Tupac said that I might not be the one who changed the world, but I guarantee you I'll spark the mind of the person who will. And I see that as my role at Open Buffalo. Open Buffalo's role in the climate justice movement is to help expose young people, Black folks, people trying to figure out where they're going to get their next meal from, that another world is truly possible, where people aren't being taken advantage of, they're not being abused on their jobs, where police won't shoot us dead in the street and walk away scot-free. Another world like what Akon is doing in Africa right now, building an entire just transition city with renewable energy. So if COVID has taught us anything, and Emily talked earlier about the intersection between health and wellness and environmental justice. So if COVID hasn't taught us anything, it's taught us that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. It's just a small snapshot of how unstable this hamster wheel that we call an economic system is, how most of us are just one check away from being evicted, while corporations like Amazon have profited billions with a B. Meanwhile, it's a minimum estimate of 15,000 New Yorkers are going to be put out on the streets December 31st. Like I said, this planet has all the resources that we need in order to sustain life. But do we have the moral courage to make sure that that happens? And this is why we have to transition to something better now. We're witnessing disproportionate cases and deaths in Black communities due to COVID. We're witnessing disproportionate death of Black folks due to police and state violence. We're witnessing a disproportionate death of Black folks to superstorms, drought, lack of access to the land. This economic devastation that we're facing is wreaking havoc on Black communities, on low-income communities, communities of color. And this is why for Black people, just transition can't just be a hashtag or some progressive campaign. It's literally a matter of life and death for us. As an organization, Black and Indigenous and other people of color leaders are calling what one of my sheroes in the movement, Maxine Burkett, calls climate reparations, right? And climate reparations are really the assessment of the harm caused by these emissions of the major polluters, but also to improve the lives of the climate vulnerable. And we talked about who the climate vulnerable are, and we're calling for direct investments into these communities to improve their everyday way of life. I know we all get nervous when we hear the term reparations somehow, but however, reparations are a common feature of international law and other communities all across the planet. And here in Western New York, we want our 40 acres plus interest. Right? And for clarity, indigenous peoples and native movements are currently engaged in what's called the land back movement. According to Dr. Ortiz, Native Americans, including those who are legal scholars, ordinarily don't use the term reparations in reference to their land claims. They're looking to rectify treaties that were negotiated out of US valid treaties. So just a small disclaimer in the language that we use. So that's almost my time, but I'm hearing people say, well, what do I do? How do I get involved? Great, I'm glad that you asked that. There's a couple of different ways. At Open Buffalo, we have a youth advisory council. In that youth advisory council, you don't have to know anything about politics, community organizing, environmental justice, just come, right? We'll start at a place, we'll walk you through it, and just come, participate. We also have an emerging leaders program. That emerging leaders program, we focus on building the community's capacity to deal with their own problems. For updates on the work that we're doing, you can like us on social media, you can download and subscribe to the podcast. And we're also a part of a local initiative called Crossroads Coalition, whereas 15 nonprofits in the area, we're dedicated to fighting for a just transition in our region. And you can like us on social media, and you can come and participate in the movement that we're building. So thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we are over 5 o'clock. Again, this is recorded, but we're on to our last panelist, so hang in with us. Our final panelist is Rebeca from National Wildlife Federation. So zooming out from Western New York a bit here. Rebeca is the Environmental Justice Program Manager at NWF. In her role, Rebeca builds capacity among the organization to participate and support environmental and climate justice agenda through relationship building, project development, and strategic planning. She also analyzes federal and state legislation and programs to develop policy proposals to ensure fair and equitable impacts and benefits for communities of color and lower income communities. Rebeca is a graduate from University of Michigan, where she earned her Master of Science in Environmental Justice, Policy and Planning, and a Master of Urban and Regional Planning in Land Use and Development in May of 2020. So take it away, Rebeca.
All right, thank you for having me. It's really amazing to just hear all the voices already, so very, very powerful. Thank you for having me today. And so just to talk a little bit about the National Wildlife Federation, we are the largest conservation organization in the United States, with over 6 million members and supporters. We have 53 affiliates in each state and territory across the nation. And we have over 7 regional offices that focus on a variety of different issue topics. And currently, we also have a national advocacy center that's located in Washington, D.C., where I'm currently based. And, you know, given the different components that folks had mentioned, I mean, I really want to emphasize that the issues that we're facing today really are accumulation of very much racist policies that have been done in the past, whether that was segregation or housing policies, or even overall disinvestment in Black and Brown and lower wealth communities. You know, folks had mentioned also the placement of highways in communities of color as well. And we're seeing those issues now, today. And so what we're doing here in the National Wildlife Federation is trying to take steps to not only just address the issues and serve as a convener to bring folks that are on the ground to these places and these decision-making points, but we're also recognize the history that we played within the larger environmental justice movement, or the lack of participation or action as well. And so similarly to the racist policies that this nation has seen since the beginning of time, we also have these embedded racist white supremacy culture in the conservation movement, and even thinking about big green organizations. And so I just want to recognize that. And National Wildlife Federation is committed to addressing that by using its power and privilege to move forward initiatives and serve as that convener and that supporter. And so next slide, please. Our goal here is to elevate environmental justice and federal policy making. And so I specifically work with the Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization Program. And so we do a lot of federal work, but we also have a Urban Initiatives and Environmental Justice Program that's been around since for over a decade, basically. So working with different folks in urban regions and trying to connect the dots between local initiatives, state, and federal policy. Next slide, please. And so the way that we're reckoning with this history and using our power and privilege to really elevate environmental justice, we're doing that through several different avenues. And first, one of our big points is making sure that we're elevating this within folks that are in these decision-making processes. And so a prime example of that is back in November of 2019, we initiated the first Environmental Justice Presidential Forum. And so it was a really great opportunity in which we were able to feature several folks at the time that were running to be president and were candidates, and to elevate the issues that are happening on the ground, and asking folks, you know, what are you doing and committing to in regards to environmental justice? We had a very good turnout. As you can see, we had Senator Cory Booker that was there and Senator Elizabeth Warren. And we didn't do this alone. This was a joint partnership with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP for short, the National Children's Campaign. And we also worked with the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. And so partnerships is a big component of our bases as well. Next slide, please. In addition to elevating this in the presidential forum, we also were big participants within the Black and Brown Forum. And so that forum is the nation's oldest minority-focused presidential forum. And as you can see there, you'll see my supervisor, which many of you might be familiar with, Mustafa Santiago Ali, on the far right. And so it was, again, an opportunity to make sure that we're elevating the issues at hand and using our platform to really move forward an agenda surrounding environmental justice. And during this forum, we focused on the disproportionate effects of climate change on communities of color. And so several key components that folks have mentioned as well during this panel discussion. Next slide, please. And so as COVID continues to decimate our Black and Brown communities, and you're seeing that within the disparities in terms of which communities are being most impacted as the pandemic continues to play a huge factor within this nation. And so we wanted to make sure that we are really highlighting the on-the-ground voices and experiences and elevating those through our different platforms. And so we had the opportunity to conduct a series of roundtables across the nation. And so we had 6 that were centered in the Great Lakes, Southeast, South Central, Gulf Coast, and Southwest. And it was really an opportunity for us to gather several frontline leaders, decision makers. We had folks on a local and state and federal basis as well, and really inviting folks to share and talk about the different issues that are happening in their communities, but also how the COVID-19 pandemic has very much so played a factor in exacerbating a lot of the issues that are currently facing. And so as you've heard from my previous panel colleagues as well, we're fighting this really intricate accumulation of racist policies, right? And so it's difficult to address these issues without also expanding our scope. That's not just environmental, but also thinking about housing, thinking about health inequities, thinking about infrastructure, and all these different elements that were really raised in the top, and thinking about the intersectional issues that causes as well. And so this was a really great opportunity for us to hear from folks on the ground and to get a better understanding on what we as an organization should be advocating for, and how can we also identify opportunities through our initiatives, whether those are programs or policies that we're advocating for. How do we make sure that people on the ground, frontline leaders, are at the table when these decision-making processes happen and occur? And so that's always front and center within our program and across the Federation as well. And we're taking a lot of strides to make sure that this is also institutionalized. We're also working with several folks, our equity and justice team as well, to make sure that as we continue to move forward, as we continue to grow and expand, we're making sure that we're applying an environmental justice lens on public policy and programming and connecting the dots to make sure that we're really helping people and addressing the issues that are happening on the ground. Next slide, please. And so in addition to having these series of roundtables, we also wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to dive deeper on the conversation. And we had a national town hall on environmental justice in frontline communities that took place in September. And so this was an opportunity to work with our partners that we've been started with since the beginning, but also to highlight several of the folks that have been leading in the cause of environmental justice. We had Monica Lewis-Patrick, for example, from Detroit, and other several leaders that have been in this space for such a long time. And so it was an opportunity, again, to talk about the issues at hand, the intersectionality of the problems, and really thinking through, as we continue to move forward and grow as a conservation movement, that we're thinking about these intersectional issues and addressing them at every opportunity that we can. And we also had Senator Cory Booker featured in our national town hall, so a really great opportunity to be able to elevate the issues at hand. And we really encourage folks, if you have time, to visit nwf.org /environmental justice to take a look at that recording. It was very, very powerful, and it featured a lot of amazing individuals on the ground as well. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, our team is mainly focused on federal policy within the Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization Program, but we also have a huge abundance of work that we're doing on a local and state level through our urban initiatives and environmental justice program. But here I just wanted to discuss a little bit of the policy components that we've been advocating for as an organization, just to give you an idea about how we've continued to elevate the environmental justice agenda, but also pushing and pulling for advocacy that can address a lot of the issues that have been raised today. And so in addition to testifying in front of Congress, as you can see, we were able to, again, elevate the issue surrounding environmental justice in several different hearings that have occurred this past year. But also we had an opportunity to co-develop and assess several important pieces of legislation that were introduced either in the House or Senate side as well. And here's just a list of a couple of those different components in which we played a really active role in making sure that not only are we working with frontline communities in cultivating and shaping the language, but that we're also using our power, our advocacy power and privilege to move this forward. Over the past year, we've specifically worked on the Water Resource Development Act, and we were able to include a equity analysis language within the bill, which is really exciting. And so this will be instrumental in identifying the distribution of state revolving funds to small and disadvantaged communities and charting a path to improve the distribution of funds to lower wealth, rural, and minority communities and indigenous people. And so this is just one example as to how we can use our efforts to help folks on the ground, either on a local or state level, by connecting those dots, right? And so oftentimes when we think about federal policy, we have such great work that's been happening and really great, WARDA is a great example where we have funds that are available to address water infrastructure, but there's a huge disconnect between communities that are actually able to benefit from those different programs and funding that are available. And so our job as well is to make sure that we're addressing those gaps, that we're advocating for policies to make sure that communities can thrive, and to make sure that that we're also using different opportunities to connect the dots and get folks on the ground to play these decision-making roles. And some of those policies that we also try to address are surrounding cumulative impacts, as well as you can see through some of the policies that were addressed through the Environmental Justice for All Act, for example, the Environmental Justice Legacy Pollution Cleanup Act as well. And so as folks had mentioned, air quality, cumulative impacts is such a huge role that we need to make sure to address. But I'll stop there. I can keep going on and on. It was a pleasure speaking with you all, and hopefully we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you to all of our panelists and all of our attendees for joining us today for this webinar. And for almost all, I'd say 90% staying 15 minutes late. So I'm sure you're probably like ready to go make dinner or eat, just like me. So thank you for hanging in there. So we hope you leave today with a better understanding of environmental justice and are inspired to continue learning and take action in your local communities. A reminder that this is part 1 of a 3-part webinar series. So to learn more, you can register for our other webinars. And I will be sending out an email right after this webinar ends with more information on and websites for our panelists to learn more about their organizations. The email will also include a short survey evaluation so that we can improve into the future. For any middle or high school students that attended today, you will be entered into that raffle for a $50 gift card prize, and I will email the winner tomorrow. If anyone has questions for panelists or for Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, you can email myself or Sarah. Our emails are up on the screen, and you all have my contact info for registering. And I will coordinate questions and answers with our panelists. So thank you so much for attending today, and enjoy the rest of your evening.